Hey, it's Phil Wade from Dalton Wade Real Estate Group, and right now we're going to be chatting about the as-is residential contract. So you've been working with a buyer, and they say, "Okay, I'd like to make an offer," and you're going to, complete the contract for them, and then send that over to them electronically. Prior to completing the contract, they may ask you to do some, comparisons of other properties to come up with a value of what that's worth. Certainly happy to help anybody that gets that question, but for right now, we're going to talk specifically about the as-is contract. In Florida, there's two contracts. There's the as-is contract that's used approximately 99% of the time, and the other one is just called the residential contract for sale and purchase. That's used much less. The difference between the two really has to do with the inspection period, some issues regarding closing out permits. In the advanced training section on the Join Dalton Wade website is a video on the difference between the two contracts. So if you want further clarification, check out that video. The as-is residential contracts, we're going to talk about that one because that's used, as I mentioned, in 99% of the cases. So, and again, in conjunction with this video, you're going to want to look at a completed contract so you can see exactly how that one was filled in. Now, for your first or even second or even third contract, I am certainly happy to review that with you. You're going to take the first crack at it, and I'm going to look at it, and if there's anything that's not in there correctly, we're going to get fixed. And so I'm here to help you on that. So don't feel that you're left out there to do this by yourself. But I will require that you actually take the first stab at it. So let's just quickly walk through it and talk about some of the key areas. So the seller's name is going to go in, your buyer's name, the property address. If we're looking at line 15, that talks about personal property. One thing that's not mentioned is the washer and dryer. So if the house has a washer and dryer in it, you need to specifically ask for that where it says additional items, number D, and type that in. If you don't, then the washer dryer doesn't have to be left, even though it was there when you looked at the house. You could have a disappointed client, so that's one to be cognizant of. If there are any items that you want your client, that you want the seller to take, maybe there's a nasty shed or some debris, you would that would kind of typically be thought to be left behind, but your client doesn't want it, you would write that in as to be removed. The purchase price, what they're offering, their initial deposit. When you're working with a buyer, you want to offer, your initial deposit needs to be as little as possible, typically $1,000. Because again, if there's ever an issue, and we'll talk about some of the key dates to make sure your buyer's deposit is always protected, less is better. Now again, everything on the contract is negotiable. A lot of times people think, oh, it's the purchase price. Well, yeah, the purchase price is a very important component of the contract, but the deposits, the closing date, the financing, those are all things that ultimately are negotiable, and everything has to be agreed upon for the property to go under agreement. So your initial deposit, if there's an additional deposit required, typically that's after the inspection period. Usually, most times that's left at zero. What the financing is, how much they're actually borrowing, right? Is it, if they're FHA, are they getting 96.5% financing? If they're conventional, are they getting, putting 20% down and financing 80%? If they're VA, maybe they're doing 100% financing. So you put down the amount that they're financing or the percentage, and then that comes down to a balance that they owe at closing, not including their closing costs. Line 43 is how long you're going to give them to accept the contract or accept your offer. Typically it's 24 hours. So if you're putting a contract in today, by the end of the business tomorrow, you want that accepted or not. So the reason why you give them a short amount of time is because if you're a good listing agent and you get a contract, you're going to go back to all anybody else who's expressed maybe some interest in the property and tell them, hey, this property is about to go under agreement, would you like to make an offer? If you get 2 offers as a listing agent, there's no more negotiating with either party. You go to what's called highest and best. You're going to ask both parties for their highest and best offer, because you can't be negotiating with 2 people as you only have 1 house to sell. What's the closing date? The closing date, typically, if they are getting a loan, you would want to coordinate, with their lender. You don't want to be saying the closing date's in 30 days and their lender can't deliver, the package until 40 days. That's not a recipe for success. So you'll want to speak with, the lender to see how long it's going to take for them to close the loan. The faster you can close, the stronger the offer. Because again, all the seller wants is to, get their money and have the transaction closed. The longer you tell them it's going to take for them to get the financing, the less, excited they're going to be, and the higher chances that they've wasted time if your client in fact can't get the loan. Next one is line 83, which is assignability of the contract. Typically we're going to put the contract cannot be assigned. Assignability has to do with when a buyer, if they want to assign the contract to someone else, typically what they're doing is they're purchasing the home, but they really don't intend to close. Not always, but sometimes. And what they're trying to do is find another buyer to better their position and assign that contract to them. They put the property under agreement for $90,000. They found someone else who will buy the contract for $100,000. They made $10,000 and they spent no money. That's how you make money in real estate without money. Not as easy to do as what I just said, but that's the concept behind it. The next one is your buyer cash buyer or are they financed? If they're cash, you check line 88. If they're financing, it's line 92. Now this is a very important one. So if they're getting a loan, and there's many in the advanced training section, there's many videos on the buyer's financing contingency. This changed back in April of this year, where now there's a date. So if your buyer doesn't get their loan, they're denied the loan, they get their deposit back. But that period, which is called the financing contingency, only lasts for so long. If the financing contingency expires, then in essence your buyer is a cash buyer now because they don't have that contingency anymore. And if they're unable to get their loan, then they don't get their deposit back. So notifying the listing agent that they've either gotten the financing or not prior to that financing contingency date expiring is very important. It has to be done. So again, watch those other videos. If you have any questions on the financing contingency, please let me know. We never want to be losing our buyers' deposits. That's a terrible thing to have happen. They thought they were buying a house. They ended up not being able to buy it because, they in the end weren't able to get the loan. And on top of it, because, you as the agent fell asleep, they're not entitled to get their deposit back. Just should never happen. Next section is in regards to who's going to pay what closing costs. That's section 9. Typically, we're going to check line 155 is the seller gets to designate the title agent, and on the contract it shows what cost the seller is going to pay and what cost the buyer is going to pay. Next is the home warranty. Sometimes if the home, some of the systems and maybe the appliances are older, you can ask for a home warranty. They're typically about $500, and that'll cover, those systems and appliances for up to a year. Again, sometimes you can ask the seller, to pay that, or the buyer. But typically, you might start with the seller paying it. And again, they don't have to pay it, and it becomes a negotiating item. The next one is any special assessments. We always want to check the seller to pay those assessments in full prior to closing. You don't want to have the buyer assuming any of those assessments, at least as it relates to your initial offer. Next one is number 12, which is the home inspection. So this is an important one. So it's an as-is contract with right to inspect. What does that mean? Typically, your buyer, if it's left blank, has 15 days. If it's not left blank, you might shorten it to make it a more attractive offer. Again, so the seller feels okay. They're really, they're working hard to get this closed. They're not stringing me along, because for any reason whatsoever, the buyer can walk away from the property, provided they've given the seller notification and get their deposit back. They don't even have to do a home inspection. They can, have the property under agreement for 2 days and change their mind. They get their deposit back. So for any reason whatsoever, the buyer can get their deposit back as long as the seller is notified within that property inspection period. Now, if you get to the end of the property inspection period and you're still negotiating, the home inspection revealed some items, and you're now asking the seller to fix these items, but you're still negotiating. You can tell the seller, well, we're going to cancel the contract unless these items are completed, and that way you've protected their deposit. Protecting their deposit is a critical function of being a buyer's agent. You should never lose your client's deposit, because if you do, basically, you in essence fell asleep at the wheel, so to speak. Only the buyer can cancel the contract; the seller can't. So be aware of the financing contingency and the home inspection contingency. The rest is boilerplate until we get down to the addendums, which is number 19, and that's actually going to be a separate video where we talk about that. So again, when you watch this video, read through the contract, understand the main points that I talked about, and then any of the other things where there are no check boxes or things to fill in, you still may get a question from your client as to what does this mean, how does this work, and the more familiar you are with the contract, the better you're able to advise them. So look for that next video on the addendums that go along with the contract.